Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Toward a Common Understanding of Market Performance. This is the latest in our 2018 series of webinars on best practices for market development. We do have two upcoming webinars that we hope you'll register for. June 14th, Prioritizing Opportunities for Growth and Expansion, and then August 8th, Cross-Organizational Sharing for Market Growth. I'll be sharing out the link to these registration pages after this webinar is over. We also encourage you to follow Helen and I on LinkedIn or join one of our special interest groups that are geared towards your specific industry. Let me introduce myself. My name is Kathleen Ojo. I'll be your moderator today. I am the commercial programs lead here at Esri. I've been with the company about 10 years, but have been on the commercial side for going on 4 months now, so still learning a lot. I'd also like to introduce Helen Thompson, who is the Global Marketing Strategy Manager here at Esri. Helen is passionate about working with businesses to help drive better decision-making through location intelligence and spatial analysis. She's been with Esri 13 years. So let's jump into our topic for today. The importance of understanding. Richard Saul Wurman famously stated that understanding precedes action. He crystallized the idea that to really solve a problem, you must understand it. Understanding a problem indicates where action needs to be taken and what that action should be. A lack of understanding or the incorrect framing of a problem leads to unintended consequences. And he cited a familiar example. For years, as cities incur more traffic, they add more freeways and highways. But does that actually solve the problem? Or does it spur the purchase of more cars, which keeps freeways congested with more vehicles while consuming more fuel, generating more pollution? Adding more lanes only invites more traffic, which is then solved by adding more lanes. Wurman pointed out that in this vicious cycle, the problem wasn't understood, but action was taken, and the problem isn't solved. The map metaphor is a powerful medium for sharing our collective geographic intelligence and how we understand our world. Geographic knowledge leads to geographic intelligence. GIS and geography help people develop a greater comprehension of issues before taking action. GIS provides an interpretive lens and analytical framework to inventory, compare, and display large, complex spatial data sets. It enables people to visualize and understand data in the context of places and how they relate, be it their city, their neighborhood, or their street. This adds a new level of understanding about the interplay between different variables, factors, and attributes, getting us closer to a true understanding of what's truly happening in a market, no matter how dynamic. Because understanding precedes action, we need to ensure we have the most relevant information and context. One guiding principle is to measure what matters and act on it. The OODA loop is a decision-making cycle originally developed by military strategists that's now often applied to understand commercial operations and learning processes. I'm going to hand it over to Helen, who will discuss the importance of orienting our understanding so the decisions we make are the most productive and successful. Helen?
Well, thanks, Kathleen, and welcome to everyone that's joining us, whether it's live on the webinar or in the recording. I want to take a moment to explain the OODA loop. This is something that's really taken off in commercial areas because it's a problem-solving framework. The fundamental starting point for this is to observe a condition, to be in a position to question why something is happening and really start to think about what does it mean. And then what you do is you orientate your thinking around that activity, that response, that trend, that competitive pressure, whatever it might be that you're observing and trying to understand. You're going to frame up the things which you think might be causing it. You're going to identify the variables which are important to analyze and understand. And you're going to really start to say, how are they correlated? How are they connected? How do they interplay around each other, as Kathleen said? You're going to decide on a course of action. You're going to monitor the response to that once you act. And by observing the response, you're going to continue this virtuous cycle of improving your performance and your decision making. This entire webinar series is about this process, the idea of establishing a common framework, a way that people understand data. In the last webinar, we talked about challenging assumptions. And then we're going to talk in the future webinars about how to share and develop that understanding in ways that start to make a difference. And one of the key things that we provide at Esri that helps you differentiate yourself is something we call predominance analysis. Predominance analysis is used to understand how related variables connect with each other. And what it simply does is to say, amongst this set of related variables or attributes, which one is the strongest, which one is the highest, which one of these 4 attributes which describe spending on restaurants is the strongest in this area. That degree of strength is a measure of how much that single variable compared with any of the others describes that area. So you can think about this as being preferences. If I had 4 variables about color, and one was red, blue, yellow, green, I could find all of the areas in which people prefer yellow over blue. I could count the number of areas in which yellow is the most important. And I can also see the degree to which people have preferences. By doing predominance analysis, I can also see the order in which these preferences occur. So are the people that prefer yellow, do they also prefer green? Or is it green and blue or blue and green? So these start to develop and show us some really interesting patterns which are underlying our data. And one of the things that predominance analysis allows us to do in that strength analysis is to really then start to look at geographic clustering and how areas sort of come together with those preferences. So hopefully when we do geographic analysis in predominance, we can see patterns in which people like to eat at a certain restaurant, like the color blue. There's a different distribution of people like blue over yellow, that like restaurant A over B, like certain types of films, browse different things on the internet, read different types of books, whatever that might be. And one of the things that really underlies this is the idea that your variables are related, right? So each one of your attribute is related and consistent, and that what you're able to do is consistently analyze the same variables in terms of their relationship to each other. And another related activity on analysis technique is similarity analysis. Similarity analysis allows us to look and measure and rank how well different areas compare to each other. So what we can do is to test a group of features against a candidate, for example, my best performing location, and then compare how all the other locations in that area compare against each other. So the rank that comes out comes from 1 through to the number of features, and you're able then to say, what's my number 1? What's my number 2? You can also compare that for dissimilarity. So you can say, what are the 50 features which are least like this location? Or what are the bottom 25, whatever that might be? And the difference between similarity and predominance analysis is that similarity allows you to group together different disparate variables which are unrelated. So you could include things like age and income and educational attainment, and you can say, let me analyze this location based on those variables, and now find me all of the other areas which are most like that, most similar to it? Well, let me get started and show you this type of analysis. I'm going to look at an area in Atlanta where I've performed some analysis on restaurant preferences. Here we are with the map. I've got 4 different brands in Atlanta that I want to understand. And I've received the data about those different brands. And here is a map shown in one of our story maps, which allows me to understand where those visits are. So of all of my 4 brands, where is the highest number of visits to these restaurants? And this was done with dine-in analysis, you know, going to the different locations, finding out where people are from, the sort of survey data or CRM-based data that many of us have. But the thing about this map is that the counts don't really reflect the true pattern which is going on in this area. Remember, in our last presentation, we talked about normalization. So counts are not counts based on population. They're really reflections of the population. So now, by dividing the total number of visits by the households in each one of these census tracts, I can get an understanding of how many visits per household goes on in these tracts. And I immediately see quite a different pattern. The blues are colder areas, the reds and oranges are warmer areas, and I can see a very strong division between the northeast, where there's predominantly blues, relatively low number of visits per household, under half a visit per month, to the reds, which are, you know, around 3/4, 1, and higher than that. So I'm going to flick back to total visits. It's relatively random, very much a reflection of the population. And now with it decided upon on total visits per household, I can see these patterns. And what's really interesting is that I've got this in the center here around Druid Hills. I've got a hot spot in the middle of the cold spot. So I'm starting to get patterns that are telling me different information. I can take the 4 restaurant brands that I was looking at and use predominance analysis to start to understand who's visiting what locations, what's their preference. Now, of these 4 brands, if you were the brand manager for restaurant number 4, you'd be pretty frustrated because you are never the most popular. Restaurant number 2 is the most popular, and it has as many visits in those areas as restaurants 1 and 3 combined. So let me say that a different way. In terms of the preference for these brands, restaurant chain number 2 is twice as popular as all other brands combined, where geographic preference is based on the number of times people visit each one of those brands. So we can see now that there's different shadings, different transparencies associated with these locations and different sizing. So the bigger the size, the more times that people are visiting in total, and the color is associated with the brands that win out, is the most popular, the predominant brand, and the transparency is the strength of the predominance. So one of the things we also see is that there's a much stronger red color throughout these areas. What that means is that there's a stronger preference for brand number 2, restaurant brand number 2, compared with all the other brands. So people aren't visiting these 4 different brands kind of willy-nilly. They go to one, then they'll go to another. There's a strong affinity associated with brand number 2, which is identified by the big red circles or the smaller circles, but actually with very strong red color. And this is a really important idea because what it measures is the brand affinity and the preference even in areas with relatively low number of visits. So these areas are not hidden by areas of very strong preference. And if you're brand number 1, the yellow in this case, you have a lot of visits, you have a lot of people that are there, you have the brand that's almost on the transition between the areas of red and the areas of blue. And you tend to be quite popular in downtown Atlanta because the yellow is both big and strong in color. So these are visualization techniques, but also very good for interpretation. I wanted to understand what was driving that. So one of the things I did is I used Esri's online data and looked at spending. And there's very, very high correlation between the brands and how much is spent. But again, I would caution you on the spending numbers because this is just total. So I would take this spending, divide by the households, and see how this is associated. So what I looked at is visits as proportion of income. So using the median household income, I can divide the total number of visits and essentially say how many dollars do I earn, or do the people in this area earn before they go and visit a restaurant. And I've color-coded this where the lower the number of dollars required before somebody goes and visits a restaurant, then the hotter the market. So what it's saying is that the frequency of visits per dollar is higher in those areas. So blue, they spend a lot of money or they earn a lot of money before they visit. Red, relatively smaller amount. And this might be a proxy for tendency to eat at restaurants, right? And we can also see now that there's very interesting correlations, right? Restaurant 1 with the bright red areas are actually associated with markets that people are earning more before they go and visit that restaurant. And this might be purely because of the strength of the income in those locations, right? It's people with high net worth, high income, high disposable income. But these are indicators of the type of analysis that I want to pursue and to understand what the underlying patterns are and reasons behind this distribution. I can also bring in Tapestry, our segmentation, and look at the life modes associated with this. And I immediately start to see some really strong correlations in the same way associated with things like that income and that restaurant activity. Those habits, those behaviors are really defining principles in Tapestry and our segmentation. They're psychographic explanations of what people want to do. So I can see how my red areas, restaurant number 2, is associated with Tapestry segments which are blue, light blue and dark blue. Restaurant number 3 showed with the blue circles, they're associated with orange and gold Tapestry segments. So one of the things that I can start to do is use the predominance to enrich the predominant segments with the tapestry associated with this. So now what I'm able to do is to separate out the areas in which restaurant number 1 is the most commonly visited restaurant in my 4 brands, and I can see the segments, the life mode segments associated with that. I can do this across all of my brands. I can see geographic patterns and concentrations. So with restaurant number 2, I have this high concentration in northeastern Atlanta,
And the suburbs, I can see that in the northeastern areas, it's light blue, which is uptown individuals. It's middle ground, it's upscale avenues, affluent estates. And if you know something about Atlanta, this is really pointing to the fact that restaurant number 2 is associated with the wealthier life mode segments that Esri has. And we could drill down into the individual Tapestry segments, the ones that many of you are familiar with things like Laptop and Latte, Professional Pride, Parks and Recs. And I'm going to do a bit of that analysis shortly. And restaurant 3 sort of fills in the gap, but there's really strong correlation here. You know, hometown and midtown singles, they dominate the locations in which people want to eat at restaurant brand number 3. So immediately what I'm getting is a sense of how well my brands map to Tapestry segments. And doing competitive analysis, one of the things that would allow me to do is to understand where this brand might be more successful than my own brand. It might also tell me, because of the lack of affinity, the way that people don't necessarily prefer any of these brands, that I could market to those areas, and it's going to tell me the type of messages that I want to deliver to those brands based on these different characteristics. And then using similarity, one of the things that I can do is to take the type of spending and relationship with those brands and say, this is my best performing location. Let me look at the brands which are in the market, and let me look at the behaviors of the people that live in each one of those census tracts, and now find me the tracts which best match the location in which I'm having the best response or the best relationship with my customers. So here what we've done is we've mapped the top 50, top 100 down to about the top 200 locations, and I'm able to prioritize the markets which show the best similarity to my best performing location. So it's telling me where I might focus on searching for a new restaurant location. It's going to tell me the areas I really should avoid. It's going to show me areas in which my competition might move into, right? This is ways to strategically start to think about how to focus on those different elements and those different characteristics associated with what started out as just restaurant visits. So let me switch back to the presentation a moment and start to investigate what we found. So for each one of the geographic areas that we looked at where the predominant brand is stronger than any of its related brands, I can do Tapestry segmentation analysis. So I can break this down between the life mode groups like Gen Urban or Affluence Estates and calculate the number of people that live or households in each one of those Tapestry segments. So what's interesting about it is that I can immediately see that there are 23,000 total visits to restaurant number 2 in a 6-month period, compared with 10,000 restaurant number 3 and 7,000 at restaurant number 1. So the combined total number of visits is greater for restaurant 2 than both of the others combined. But it also has a wider range of segments and life mode categories that it's attracting. If we look at this further, we can see where we have commonality. So restaurant number 2 shares 4 of those life mode groups with restaurant number 1. But look at this in more detail. The individual segments within those categories is quite different. Look at ethnic enclaves. So restaurant number 2, we have 1,300 visits from ethnic enclaves compared with about 1,000 in restaurant number 1. In restaurant number 2, it's up and coming families exclusively. In restaurant number 1, it's American Dreamers and Barrios Urbanos. When we do similar analysis with Midtown Singles, it's about 900 visits compared with over 2,000 visits for restaurant number 2. Metro Fusion dominates with nearly half of those visits, but for the Midtown Singles in restaurant number 1, it's exclusively set to impress. And we can do the same analysis and comparison analysis with restaurant number 3 and see how much correlation and crossover there is. And what's really interesting about the analysis for this group of restaurants is that none of them share the same individual tapestry segments. Some of this is about geographic distribution, the urbanicity of those segments, but also a lot of it is because they're attracting different groups to these restaurants in terms of the food products they own, the way they market, the location in which the restaurants are situated. So we can compare the percentages. So Gen X in restaurant 1 is about 1/3 than compared with restaurant 2. The total number of people from Parks and Recs is about the same as the in-style visitors in the Gen X group, which are coming to restaurant number 2. So we can start to use this type of analysis to really understand who are our core visitors. How do they individually make up the predominant number of the predominant type and number of people coming to our restaurant? So it's a great way to say, look, in restaurant number 2, where it's predominantly this Midtown Singles group, only 0.4% of all of the people coming into your restaurant are city strivers. So you want to look at other things associated with that. City strivers tend to be single, about 35 years of age. They live, very much downtown, but they're nowhere near as important to you in this area as Metro Fusion. Metro Fusion are 1/20th of the entire segment visiting this restaurant. So find other places with Metro Fusion. Find other places with these key groups like Emerald City, right? That's one of the core segments associated with this restaurant brand. And so anybody can use this type of analysis to really start to understand who are the people living in the areas that are influencing how your brands perform. You can use this for competitive analysis. So I can very quickly bring up a chart like this, a set of pie charts which allow me to compare the difference between them. I can use now these core life mode groupings to really build together prototypes or analogs of how my stores or types of stores, competitors or different brands, operate and where they're best suited. So if I'm a real estate developer looking to place a restaurant in my hometown, an economic developer looking to do the same thing, or the brand itself, I can use this to immediately start to understand where is the market that I will go to, where the people are best like the areas where I'm already doing well, or where are the places that I should avoid. A bank can use this type of analysis to understand people's preferences for loans, auto loans, the type of cars they drive, the likelihood to upgrade into a different type of vehicle. Insurance companies to sell different types of products. Telecoms companies to look at the preference between iPhones and Android phones, between different carriers. I mean, there's many ways this type of analysis is applied. And it's really an important fundamental way to think about data and the insights associated with this. So what have I found in summary from my Atlanta analysis? There's strong correlation between the frequency visit and the dominant restaurant chain. We know just how strong that correlation is, and what that means is that it's always number one. In the markets where it's number one, it's strongly number one. And so if you want to come into the markets where that restaurant chain is, you are probably not going to be number one, but you can compete against the second and third brands in those markets, but you've got to win market share off them. So focus your efforts on winning market share against the weaker competition rather than that dominant player. We know that each restaurant draws from different tapestry segments, and there's some overlap, but it allows us to really focus on our messaging and our marketing associated with that. We can build a prototype, as I said, an analog for how well each one of these sites fits a particular brand. And we can use the affinity of those brands to really understand where I can run marketing campaigns, offer discounts, change the way my store's oriented or my restaurant, the type of products associated with those locations to win over a new group of customers. So this is a key thing in terms of, it's not just about identifying new places to expand, it's about understanding the ways in which you can change your existing operations to capture a new audience, to expand the percentage of your best customers, and to keep those customers happy in terms of the expectations that they have. But also when they visit a competitor, they test a competitor, they research something new or they do something new, you also will have insights into what that might mean for your brand and for the type of services and products that you offer. I want to highlight the issues of geographic and tapestry clustering. On the bottom right-hand side, we can see the strong clustering associated with some of these brands, particularly brands 2 and 3. What that means is that these are essentially creating sort of cohesive trade areas. You can think of this as the preferable place for that type of product and service. So if your product is related to another brand, let's say that you're looking for burger eaters who like to eat at, let's say, Wendy's, right? But you want to offer a different product, and let's say it's a chicken sandwich rather than a burger. You can find the areas which have preference for Wendy's and then understand that that's your target market for offering your chicken burger. And obviously the weight and the strength of that predominance will influence the degree to which you can be successful. But it's a great way of prioritizing and identifying those markets. And what we really saw, if I was one of the brand in this area and I was looking to expand, I would strongly recommend that we go to the western suburbs for the highest opportunity, the highest similarity, and the areas west of I-75. One of the great tools that I talked about in the last webinar was our tapestry summaries, which are based on life mode. And everybody's very familiar with how they group together into these things like the affluence estates, upscale avenue, and other things. But we've also built these life mode groups into urbanization groups. So each tapestry segment, you can find out where people live in terms of they living in the suburban periphery, in the big metro cities, in the downtown urban centers. And that allows us to think about the distribution of these segments. So laptops and lattes that live in the urban centre are not going to be found in the suburbs. So one of the mistakes that I find a lot of people using Tapestry do is they don't understand those geographic variations and that urbanization variation. So what they do is they say, well, my core group, because I've looked at a city, is laptop and lattes. I'm going to go and find them out in rural Idaho or in Pennsylvania. And then they discover that there aren't any laptops and lattes. So what I do is show people how you look at the comparison variables. And what you can do is to build a model in which you say, for this different type of urbanization, what are the sister segments associated with laptop and lattes? So in our metro cities and our rural areas, what are the groups that I'm looking for and should find in the different geographic urban areas that I'm prospecting into? And some of them might be sister categories. So really understanding this is quite important, and it's a great opportunity. We've got a short URL for this, and I really encourage you to go look at it and start to explore some of the things associated with this. So we can see how these different groups tend to be concentrated. So if we look at the urban center, I'll make this a little bigger, and we'll just zoom in at the principal urban center here. So if you look at this, we have groups 3A, 3B, 3C. So all of our lifestyle group called uptown individuals, A, B, and C, live in the urban core. They're metro renters, trendsetters, and the infamous laptops and lattes. One of our segments, 8D, which comes from the middle ground group, live downtown, right? And then there's 3 from 13. 13 is the next wave, and they're all living downtown as well. And you can see how these different groups congregate in different areas. And you can also see in these urban cores, the people that are single, people are married, we can look at their age. So each one of these different attributes I can use to start to build an understanding of how they come together. So if we look at soccer moms, for example, they live on the urban periphery. There are 10 million of them. There's 3.5 million households of that type, right? They live in areas which are not downtown, but they're not living in rural areas. And when we think about it, this is pretty logical that we would have entire segments, like the rural segments, which are made up of predominantly a group of segments which really define being, married. They're on the far periphery. They've got these different expectations. So I'd encourage you all to look at these tables, to explore them, and start to investigate how these impact your markets and your areas. So let me try and summarize all of this for you. I really think about improving understanding against these 5 principles. The first one is to normalize related data, right? To normalize data and show how it isn't just a map of population distribution, but how it is a statistical measure of the people that live there. So divide the total number of restaurant visits by the number of households. Divide the number of foreign automobiles bought in a market by the total number of automobiles purchase in that market. Really explore how these different variables interrelate and are correlated. You're going to use predominant analysis. You're going to say, what is the number one thing happening here? What is the most simple way of explaining the behavior? Where do they prefer this activity, this brand, this type of product compared with the others that I want to look at? And that's using variables, activities, patterns of behavior which are related. So it might be to say, where do people eat? Burgers over chicken, noodles over Hispanic food, right? Use predominance analysis to really understand those preferences. Use similarity analysis to classify how well areas match or differ from your best or worst locations. Caution again about the impact of urbanizations. A lot of people generate trade areas and then they get out further and further, 15 minutes, 15 miles. As you get in further and further, you're starting to get people that are less and less urbanized. If you're in a city, you've got different concentrations, different geographic distributions, and that gives you different tapestry segments, and it gives you different behaviors. So really think about how you can keep your trade area as small as possible so that you're not seeing those big geographic areas where the behaviors behind them start to change very significantly. You can use predominant analysis to create your own custom trade areas. It doesn't have to be drive times or rings or donuts or walk times. Some of the things you can do is to take the predominance areas and lasso all the areas which have similar characteristics. And to think about, how do I zero in on the most important criteria for decision making? To use this type of correlation and statistical analysis to really start to say, what are the things that make a difference compared with everything else? Because ultimately, your data has a story to tell, and what you're trying to do is to use this type of analysis to let your data tell its story. So I encourage you to come and have a look at a few examples. We have something called the Market Explorer, which allows you to type in a zip code and see some summary statistics. Once you sign up for that, you can use it in unlimited ways. It's completely free to use, but we do ask you to just type in your information associated with that. There's a great story map on the lifestyle profile analysis, which was done by one of our business partners, Data Story, which explores these types of behaviors using groupings of customers to look at people as they're distributed around a store and start to profile them. What is the difference between the top 40% of our customers, 60% based on their proximity to the store, and how does that generate a profile for what our best or closest customers look like? The Birds of a Feather story map goes into a lot of detail about comparison analysis on different attributes, everything from spending based on age to the influence of income, where people live, how do they commute, and it's based on a anonymized CRM database. The Public Transit in Atlanta story map brings together some of this analysis in more detail, and will actually, if you visit this one, you'll see some of the reasons why we see some of those different patterns in the preferences of the different brands, and how much, in many cases, access to different forms of transport and different urbanicity influences the way that people interact with brands. And then for those that are very technically inclined, there's an entire workshop for looking at community analysis for a retirement community, and it goes through everything from the hotspot analysis that I featured in the last webinar to then using some of this predominance and core segments to really then hone in on the markets that I should be targeting. So to break from the national level into some of the key markets that want to look at it. So within these examples is really something for everybody, and really appreciate you taking the time to listen to us. So I'm going to hand it back to Kathleen for some questions.
Thank you so much, Helen. Let's pull a couple questions from the audience that were submitted during this course of this webinar. First one, let's do, how do I find the areas which are the least similar to my location?
So a couple of ways of doing that in the similarity tool. Really the best way is to just find the best location and then rank all of the other locations associated with that, and that'll generate a score. So if you've got 100 locations, you'll find, you know, number 1 is the best, 90 to 100 are the worst. The other way is to create a prototype of what you don't want in your store, right, or for your location. So what's the worst possible set of characteristics, and then do similarity analysis using that. And somewhere in between is actually competitive analysis, in which you can use the characteristics of a competitor to see the areas which are most like the best performing or the most competitive location.
All right. How do I save the predominance score in ArcGIS Online?
Good question. There isn't a easy way to do that at the moment. The predominance analysis is a visual statistical analysis that's created with ArcGIS Online, and there's not a simple way to do it. But one way you can do it, and I'm happy if you want to reach out to me about this, I can show you how to do it, is that you sum all of the categories that you're looking at to create a total score. In this case, I showed total number of restaurant visits, and you find the one which has the greatest number of visits, and you divide the visits to that store or that location by the total number, and it will give you the predominant score. And that's all possible using ArcGIS Online, but you have to use some of the other tools like find existing locations.
Okay. How about, what's the difference between smart map search and predominance analysis?
So let me explain a little about what this question is. So smart map search is a technique in Business Analyst Online for showing the distribution of different variables, where you can move sliders up and down to see where those different attributes are located. In Business Analyst Web, that's typically used to identify the areas in which a site meets a set of conditions or characteristics. Predominant analysis isn't really the same. Predominant analysis is based on saying, of these 5 variables, where is, of these 5 variables, in which area is one the most common, right? So you're not trying to see a combination of all of those variables. You're just trying to find the one which is the most common, the strongest, has the highest score in that area. So quite different things to be pursuing.
Okay, next question. Can I get the table explaining how to use this type of analysis?
Yes, we're making the table that I showed today on similarity and predominance analysis, as well as the one that I showed in the last webinar on hotspots, available to everybody. And we'll send you out a link to where you can download that.
Excellent. All right, let's squeeze in one more. Can I use a predominance map in Business Analyst?
Yes and no. The Business Analyst allows you to use maps which you've created in ArcGIS Online and bring them up and use them as the basis for analysis in Business Analyst Web or Business Analyst Desktop. The thing about, as I said earlier, the predominance example is that the predominance isn't actually stored as an attribute in the feature service that business analysts would be able to use. So you'll need to do, the find locations analysis, or do some calculations of new fields to really then be able to use that predominance analysis in BA. But it is something that we know that lots of people want, and bug us about it, right? Get on the Esri forums and write to us, and use the SIG groups to say, what I want to do is we want the predominance score to be a new attribute that's created as part of that analysis, not just visual representation of the data. And Esri listens to people, and you all can influence our software direction. So encourage you to reach out if it's something that you want to do.
All right. Thank you very much, Helen. We've run a little bit long, so thank you all for hanging with us today. We hope you will reach out on LinkedIn and connect with us, and we do hope to see you back here on June 14th for the next webinar in our series.